Good evening, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Journey to Reparations, which is sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey and its Reparations Task Force. The task force has been assigned and commissioned to study how we as a diocese, the Diocese of New Jersey, can address the original sins of racism and slavery. As we know, New Jersey was central to the slave trade in America, and many of the churches of the Episcopal Church and other denominations were established and supported directly or indirectly by the institution of slavery. The task force was established at the Diocesan Annual Convention, and it is led by three co-conveners, Canon Annette Buchanan, Canon Barbie Bach, and Canon Noreen Duncan. They and the task force have convened tonight's panel discussion with the support of your bishop, Bishop Chip Stokes. Tonight's panel discussion will feature Professor Kendra Boyd and digital archivist Jesse Bayker. But before we begin with our discussion tonight, let us also recognize this special moment, this sacred moment of our engagement on this important topic. And as we are the hands and the feet of Jesus, let us also acknowledge in doing the liturgy of the work of the people that there's an opportunity for us to pray with our feet. And the coming announcement will indicate what that opportunity is.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here at our second in a series of webinars. Bishop Stokes has asked us to organize an action in the state of New Jersey. He has asked us to take the lead in House Speaker Craig Coughlin's district to advocate for the passage of two legislations, S322 and A711, acts calling for the establishment of a statewide reparations task force in New Jersey. These bills have languished with Speaker without Speaker Coughlin bringing them to vote for almost 3 years. So this action is a pressure for him to act. So we'll be having two meetings. The first is a virtual rally, which will be held on Monday, October 11th at 7 p.m. The second will be an in-person rally at 10 a.m. at St. Peter's in St. Amboy. The reason why we're choosing St. Peter's in St. Amboy, as many of you may know, is that Mr. Thomas Peterson Mundy was known to be a parishioner of the church, and he was the first African-American of the U.S. to cast a vote under the enactment of the 15th Amendment. So we're asking you as an action with both hands and feet to attend the virtual rally. Again, that's October 11th at 7 p.m. The in-person rally, which is going to be October 30th at 10 a.m. at St. Peter's Amboy, and to call your legislators to support these bills, S322 and A711, to support a statewide reparations task force in New Jersey. We will also have a petition for you to sign, so we hope that when these information come to your attention, you will give it your utmost priority. Thank you again, and we look forward to the webinar. Back to you, Reverend Chuck.
I'm reminded, and we're all reminded in the chat from Canon Barbie Bach, to say reparations now when you attend the in-person rally. So before we go into the interactive discussion, let me first give an introduction to our two speakers and our guests tonight. First, we have Dr. Jesse Bayker. Dr. Bayker is the research project manager and digital archivist at the New Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And he manages the Scarlet and Black Digital Archive, which uses the historical primary sources to shed light on the legacy of slavery and dispossession at Rutgers University. He began his work with the Scarlet and Black Project as a doctoral researcher and has contributed chapters to 2 books in the Scarlet and Black series from Rutgers University Press. He holds a PhD in history from Rutgers and a BA in history in LGBTQ studies from Brooklyn College. Dr. Bayker is joined tonight by his colleague, Dr. Kendra Boyd. She is an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey. She earned a BA in business administration from Wayne State University and a PhD in history from Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Dr. Boyd's teaching and scholarship focus on African-American history, racial capitalism, and urban history. She has been deeply involved with efforts to diversify historical narratives of Rutgers University and New Jersey. From 2017 to 2018, she supervised and administered research on African-American history as the inaugural Scarlet and Black postdoctoral associate. The research findings were published in Scarlet and Black Volume 2, Constructing Race and Gender at Rutgers, 1865 to 1945, which she co-edited with Marissa Fuentes and Deborah Gray White. She's also co-authored 2 chapters of Scarlet and Black, Volume 1, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History. Currently, she is working on an oral history project about African-American history in Camden, New Jersey. Please join me by welcoming them in ways that we have come accustomed to by Zoom. So welcome, welcome. All right, so now we get started. So Doctors Boyd and Bayker, would you describe Scarlet and Black, this exploration of African-American and Native American experience at Rutgers, and provide us with background of how it came about and the role of archival history in advancing the project?
So I'll start us off by telling you a little bit about what is Scarlet and Black and how it came about. So Rutgers is a very old institution. It was chartered in 1766. So in 2016, our school was coming up on our 250th anniversary. And this anniversary really served as the point, a turning point where more people started asking questions about different aspects of our history that before were not really at the forefront. So there was a lot of celebration planned for this 250th anniversary, a lot of talk about revolutionary Rutgers and our Scarlet pride, right? Scarlet is the color, the school color of Rutgers. And during these preparations for these celebrations, a group of students approached the administration, and this was primarily students who were affiliated with the campus Black Lives Matter movement. And they asked the administration, well, if you're going to talk about how proud we should be of the fact that our school was founded in the revolutionary era and how proud we should be of this legacy, shouldn't we also talk about some of the things that like slavery and dispossession that are also taking place in this moment in time? And what is Rutgers' role in these things? And the answer at that moment from the administration was, well, we're not really sure what Rutgers' role was because we haven't really looked into it that deeply. And that's a shortcoming. And that's a shortcoming that our administrative leadership recognized. And from that came this research effort that became the Scarlet and Black Project. So we got resources to really go into the archive and do the archival work to look at this history anew and to ask this question: what is the role and the responsibility of Rutgers University in enslavement and anti-Black oppression in that moment in time, as well as dispossession of Native Americans of their land? So from that work came this book, Scarlet and Black, Volume 1, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History. So we published this book in 2016, and really from that started having more of a conversation on campus about reshaping the way that we tell the Rutgers story. What is our legacy, really? And there's a lot of our findings that were published with this book highlighted that many people connected with Rutgers had a role in upholding slavery in New Jersey, or in enriching themselves and enriching the institution through slavery. So that's something that we really wanted to bring forth. And one of the things that, some of the things that came out from that, of course, was not just the books, but talking about reshaping the campus space, renaming some of the buildings and spaces on campus, putting up historical markers, and really sharing this history beyond just the book. And another way that we share the history beyond the book is through the digital archive that I curate, where we present some of the actual historical documents that we found as evidence for the Rutgers ties to slavery. And we put them online to make it freely accessible for educators and for researchers to be able to dig into that. And then, of course, another thing that came out of this effort was then the question of, well, does this stop at slavery, this conversation of legacy, of anti-Blackness? And there was an imperative to continue that work with 2 other volumes. And I think I'll let Dr. Boyd jump in and talk about those other books.
Right, so I've put the link for the Scarlet and Black Project Archive, the digital archive, in the chat. But we decided, after doing the research for the first volume, well, we made many recommendations, including putting campus markers, creating scholarships. But one of our recommendations was to continue the work, to not just stop after 1865, because as we can all gather, racism didn't stop with emancipation. So we decided, and the administration supported us, to continue researching the history of Rutgers through the present. And this led to then the researching and the creation of 2 more volumes. The second volume, Scarlet and Black Volume 2, goes from 1865 to 1945, and that was published in 2020. And then in spring 2021, we've published the 3rd volume, which looks from 1945 to the present. So this allowed us to look at more of the modern history of actual Black experience on campus, and the ways that Rutgers continue to spread racist ideology. And doing archival research for these was, of course, the place to start, but going into the modern period also allowed us to look at oral histories and conduct some oral histories in order to hear firsthand from Black people what they experienced in relation to Rutgers. So that was a good opportunity in moving into the modern time period. But of course, it's essential to look at the archive, to really go back in history and trace from slavery to the present, right? In this moment of Black Lives Matter, of calls for racial justice, we often ask ourselves the question of, how did we get here, right? You need to know how we got here in order to come up with adequate solutions. So we felt that we couldn't do justice to our history or to really working on solutions if we didn't look from slavery to the present. So that's the gist of the project, the background of the project.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd, and thank you, Dr. Bayker. The work is extremely impressive. So is the way that you work as a team. Equally impressive are the questions you use to frame your research and the work that you are doing. And I recall that you asked the question, what does it mean to say that Rutgers' shared responsibility in the enslavement of Africans and anti-Blackness? That was a question that you all used to frame some of the work. Can you speak to the significance of that question for Rutgers and how the history of the seminary, which many of us are unfamiliar with the history that Rutgers had a seminary, the Dutch Reformed Church also can be instructive to and for the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey in asking a similar question. What does it mean to say that Rutgers shared responsibility in the enslavement of Africans and anti-Blackness?
Well, I think that there are multiple answers to the question of what does it mean to say shared responsibility in enslavement. And there are some more obvious ways that we approached our research and some less obvious ways. So the more obvious things are labor and money, right? So we had to ask, to what extent did Rutgers as an institution use enslaved labor to build up the institution itself? And we were able to find records that clearly showed that Rutgers didn't own as an institution, but hired from other people, enslaved people, to come and actually construct the buildings that are on campus that still stand on campus. And in that way, we had enslaved people who were actually laying the foundation for the buildings that became Rutgers. So right from the start there. So in terms of labor, that's what we looked at. So another kind of more obvious thing to look at is money. How was the institution funded? And when we looked at money and who funded the institution, right? As you mentioned, Rutgers actually was established by the Dutch Reformed Church. And initially the idea for the school was, it was connected with the seminary. So the idea for the college was to train those people who would go on then and study at the seminary. But first they needed to go to college and get their degree from what was called Queen's College at the time. So in order to fund that, part of how the school raised money, a lot of it was through different Dutch Reformed congregations. So it wasn't only in New Jersey, it was also congregations with wealthy members in New York City, congregations in Albany. And when we looked at who are the people, when we actually looked at the donation list and who are the people given the biggest chunks of money that is then funneled to the school, then we saw that a lot of those people were people who gained their wealth through exploiting slave labor or through participating in the slave trade. So these were people who were not necessarily on campus, right? They were not the ones that were running the day-to-day show, but they were given money that actually enabled the institution to get on a solid financial footing and really saving the institution at a time when the school didn't have a lot of money and they had money coming in from these slaveholding families. I think there's a couple of less obvious ways to look at responsibility, and Dr. Boyd can probably talk about that a little bit.
I just wanted to add to your point, Jesse, that besides the people who were donating money, just the students who were coming to the school, these were people who were coming from elite families. If you're an elite family, that means you have wealth, and your wealth, of course, is going to be tied to the slave trade in some way. But in terms of the students, this relates to another sort of less obvious point of the university's responsibility is the racial ideologies that was taught in the classroom and in the seminary. So, Rutgers, what became Rutgers, and then what is now the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, these were at one time the same institution. These professors and these church leaders who were teaching there, they espoused and they spread the ideas of the time, which often, when it came to race, were, of course, racist, that Black people were inferior, that is one of the reasons why they are enslaved, a justification for slavery. When it comes to race science, in the late 19th and early 20th century, teaching that Black people are just biologically inferior. And in terms of the church specifically, in their mission outreach, in terms of domestic outreach when it came to Native Americans or converting African Americans, there was, of course, this idea that Black people and Native American people are savage, they're inferior, they are barbaric, and this is why we need to convert them and change their natural ways. And this, of course, continued with international missions. So these types of things relate to the institution's place as educating and also providing the space for church leaders, future church leaders, to spread a gospel that inherently believed racist things about Black people. In addition to that, there was just the fact that the Dutch Reformed Church, they didn't repudiate slavery. Even then there was calls for them to apologize or just to make a statement that slavery is a moral wrong. They talked about it, but they didn't want to, make waves in the water. They knew that many in their congregation owned slaves. And even if certain church leaders maybe felt that morally this is wrong, they didn't want to make an official statement because what types of problems is this going to cause for us? It's going to be controversial. So these are some of the ways that, just in terms of the ideology, the school and the seminary participated in anti-Blackness, even if it was not directly related to the church owning slaves. And besides just the racial ideology and education at the time, there's also the issue of who was the leaders, who got to speak, and who got to be a leader in the church and also in the community. So Jesse, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Oh, yeah, well, I think another way that we looked at responsibility was this question of, the people who are leading the university, they are also prominent leaders in their community. A lot of the time at Rutgers, and the historical campus was located in New Brunswick in Middlesex County. Of course, now Rutgers has other campuses in other cities, but historically in the time of slavery, we're talking about New Brunswick. Well, the people who were running the university were also running the city. And some of them were also then going on to political office at the state level. So we looked at how are they moving through the world in those spaces as political leaders as well, and how they shape in the city where Rutgers is located. And some of the things that we found there were that some of these leaders of the university were, through their work outside the university, facilitating slave sales. So, for example, the man who was really responsible for raising money for building up the campus in the early 19th century, he owned a newspaper in which he published slave sale advertisements. And oftentimes those advertisements asked people to actually use him as the facilitator. So the advertisement would say, "This, we're selling this person," and go to the newspaper office, and the man who publishes the newspaper, Abraham Blavelt, he will facilitate the sale and connect you with us. So that type of work that they were doing. Other people were also, we found, colluding in the illegal slave trade that was going on in the early 19th century in New Jersey. And so this is something that a lot of the time we don't hear a lot about in New Jersey history, but after in the international slave trade is no longer legal, after 1808, there is still in New Jersey and many other places, of course, people are rounding up Black people and sending them down to Louisiana through the interstate slave trade. And a lot of people from the upper South are moving to places like Louisiana and Mississippi. But what we found is that this is actually also happening in New Jersey, because in New Jersey, in this moment of time, this is the start of gradual abolition, and it means that slavery is on the decline in the state of New Jersey. So for people who want to still continue enriching themselves from the fact that they had purchased slaves or had slaves in their household, they are trying to sell those Black people for the highest price that they can, and they're going to sometimes sell them down to Louisiana, even at a point in time when the New Jersey state legislature is starting to put some roadblocks for that because they recognize that this is inhumane, separating families and sending them down to another state. So there is a public conversation in New Jersey about that. And yet when we look at some of the leaders of Rutgers, they are actually colluding in rounding up people, sending them to Perth Amboy and sending them down to Louisiana. And also, as we get into this period of gradual abolition, by the 1820s, we have the university leaders, some of them are, they're participating in establishing a policing system for now the free Black people who are being emancipated through the gradual abolition in New Jersey. Well, when these people are ewemancipated, then a lot of the white leaders in the city of New Brunswick, they say, well, this is a problem for us. We don't want these newly freed Black people here, and we want to make sure that they behave how we want them to behave. And so they establish a policing system, they establish a curfew, and so that we're talking about not just enslaved Black people, but now free Black people in New Jersey are under this form of surveillance. And so some of the Rutgers leaders had a hand in that as well.
So it reminds me, it seems to be a connection with regard to the ongoing issues of policing in New Jersey that didn't just appear with regard to the Black Lives Matter era, but also in the 80s and the 90s with regard to the troopers, and back then it was called racial profiling. And so it goes on to basically, it reminds me that this project grapples not only with the roots of slavery in New Jersey, it continues beyond that history. And so how would you characterize the important periods of history in the project? And why was it important to move beyond the roots of slavery, period, full stop, and go further?
Well, I think for New Jersey, when we're talking about issues of reparations, there are multiple points in time that are really important in New Jersey history. The first point would really be the moment of gradual abolition, because this is in 1804. So the history here is that in 1804, New Jersey becomes the last northern state to finally adopt a gradual abolition program. And the gradual abolition program in New Jersey says that starting on July 4th, 1804, anybody born after that date, if this child is a girl, then she will have to work for 25 years, for 21 years and be enslaved to her mother's master for 21 years. And if that baby is a boy, then for 25 years, he will have to work for his mother's master before he can become free. So it takes a very long time for Black people in New Jersey to start actually getting the benefit of this program. It takes decades, and it's such a drawn out process that New Jersey still has enslaved people up until the Civil War and up until the general emancipation during the Civil War. There are still some enslaved people in New Jersey. But the Gradual Abolition Act, although it said, that people born after 1804 would eventually become free, it did not provide anything for those people, right? So if you're a 25-year-old Black man who has been working for your whole youth for your mother's master, then you are 25, and the law doesn't say that you're actually entitled to anything for those years that you have been working. So you have to make your own way. You don't get any back wages. You don't get anything when you become emancipated through that. And certainly there's a case to be made that's still there's a lot of unpaid labor there, even for the people who are becoming free, that they're not getting any kind of reparations for. So that's, I think, one of the biggest things from that time period to really think about. But I think even going into the 20th century, and I think Dr. Boyd can talk more about the 20th century, there are important moments in time to think about.
Definitely. So not even before you get to the 20th century and the entire sort of Jim Crow era from the late 19th century until the Civil Rights Movement, you see some of the same things that we imagine happen in the South, that they were fighting for during the Civil Rights Movement in the South, you see the same things in New Jersey. So the exclusion of Blacks from certain jobs, de facto racial segregation in New Jersey, segregation in schools, and in colleges. At Rutgers, there continued to be segregation through the 1960s, well after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came in 1954. So this is why we then see a lot of student activism in the 1960s. And there really is not an influx of diverse students until after 1969 in New Jersey. So some of the things that started after slavery in terms of structural racism that continue to keep Black people economically oppressed, socially oppressed, this was just sort of exacerbated with the Great Migration when you saw lots of African Americans coming from the South to northern states, including to New Jersey, and you see a huge increase in New Jersey's Black population in the early 20th century. You have Southerners coming who are looking for a freer place, and what they encounter is just a new version of Jim Crow. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when studying this history. And another thing related to that is during the Great Migration, we have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, the second Ku Klux Klan, right? The first Ku Klux Klan originally came after the Civil War, and then it subsided. And then in the 1920s, there was an explosion of the Ku Klux Klan, including in New Jersey. New Jersey at one time had 60,000 members of the KKK. There were rallies across the state, including in New Brunswick, where 12,000 people would show up to burn crosses. And the type of terror, psychological terror that had on Black people in New Jersey shouldn't be underestimated, right? This is one of the tools for, keeping Black people in their place in New Jersey and, sort of circumscribing efforts to push for justice is the use of terror and the threat of violence. So I think that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about tracing the legacy of slavery to the present. It didn't just stop, right? These forms of violence, of policing, they just found new forms in order to maintain white supremacy.
And so Dr. Bayker has placed a link regarding you all's work and research in your exhibit on the KKK in the chat. Got a couple more questions that I plan to ask you. And as we come upon around the midway point for our evening, I invite those attending to place your questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to have them posed to our panelists. So you have a particular interest in the Black Power movement, the Black Power period, in the role of the Episcopal priest, the Rev Nathan Wright. Why is this period important in looking at the question of reparations? And why should we, though the majority of us gathered tonight listening to you all, are Episcopalians? So what should we know about Nathan Wright, the Reverend Nathan Wright?
I think the Black Power era is instructional for us now in this moment of, Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of parallels that can be made in terms of the amount of racial violence we're seeing, the calls for reparations and racial justice. The Black Panther Party, this is one of the most famous Black Power organizations, and in their initial 10-point program, they called for reparations. And the Black Manifesto in 1969, which specifically called for reparations, particularly from white churches and synagogues. I think this is instructional because there's a moment where we're looking for leaders, we're looking for people to do the right thing, right? This is the idea behind the Black Power movement, the call for reparations, that we've been through the civil rights movement. And still, a lot of things haven't changed. So who is really going to take up the call of true justice? Some people thought we need a revolution to do it, but others thought that we need to ask the church to be the leaders, right? Who else is going to be the model of fighting for true justice, if not the church? And so for me, I think Reverend Wright, why he's a great example is because he truly listened to Black Power activists. He listened to youth who were, oftentimes more radical, but he worked, as you know, at the Episcopal Diocese in Newark. He was the head of their urban outreach program and actually chaired the 1967 National Black Power Conference, which was the first Black Power conference in the US, to have real conversations, to say and understand that even though we have maybe different methods, maybe we use different language, we all actually still have the same goal. And why I think he's such a great model and someone to look up to is because when he did come into bumps in the road with disagreements, with, Black Power activists sometimes calling him too moderate or saying not the nicest things to him, he didn't let that deter him. He continued down the road towards open conversation and to work together to try to get our same goal of racial and economic justice. So that's why I look to him as a leader. He was very brave, I feel, in saying, I'm going to chair this National Black Power Conference. I'm going to get it to be held at the diocese in Newark, and to ask for the church to pay for some of this conference, because he got a lot of backlash. And as you can imagine, when these radical activists are asking for money and asking for drastic changes, sometimes people are set in their ways. And he faced a lot of backlash for communicating with these people and for, taking up the cause of Black Power, basically. But he felt that this is the right thing to do. So I think for us in the modern period, it's like these conversations are uncomfortable. Not everybody's going to agree that we should pay reparations, right? But if we truly have the same goal of justice, of equality, of love, we have to keep the conversation going, no matter the bumps in the road.
Yes. So I just want to say a couple quick things, and to know that because we want to leave space for questions from folks attending. We're all here together, but I want to note first that Jack Zamboni has placed in the chat information from the Episcopal Archives regarding Reverend Nathan Wright. I believe you said, Dr. Boyd, that Reverend Wright did some important work in 1969. I believe that was one of the years you mentioned.
The conference for the National Black Power Conference was in 1967. It took place right after the urban uprising, the riot that took place in Newark. So, it was a hot moment. So it was really important for him to, continue the conference. They didn't know, are we going to call off this conference? He said, no, we're going ahead with this conference. And this is just a sign that we need to have these conversations even more.
Yes. And so then in 1969, the Black Manifesto was written. James Foreman was one of those who wrote that, and he, along with others, delivered the manifesto not only to, I think, Riverside Church, but also showed up at 850, what we call 815 Second Avenue, where the Episcopal Church's offices are, in the presiding bishop's office. And in that manifesto, just in the introduction, Foreman says, for centuries, we have been forced to live as colonized people inside the United States, victimized by the most vicious racist system in the world. We say white people in this country, they must be willing to accept Black leadership, for that is the only protection we have against racism. And that was 26th of April of 69. And then May 7th of 69, the National Committee of Black Churchmen, antiquated language, but that's what it was called. But the National Committee of Black Churchmen wrote, we are mindful that the program proposed has troubled the waters of Siloam. Yet we know that however much the churches may shake to the vibration of their own cleansing, the healing of Christ is working upon them. So, I mean, I think those two statements connect very much to what you were saying about Reverend Wright and his connection nationally and the movement that was flowing. And then I would love to have some folks ask you the questions around the arc of history in New Jersey, not just the Black Power period, but the urban aspects of it, the structural parts of Newark that laid the seed for the riots, the structural parts of Asbury Park and these other places, Neptune, those structural histories that are connected to why Newark is so important. But perhaps somebody will ask that question. Let me move to the next two questions before going to again ask our attendees for questions. Do you have any general counsel that you would give to congregations, dioceses, and Episcopal institutions in the Diocese of New Jersey and its people as they grapple with questions of reparations? Dr. Boyd, Dr. Bayker, what counsel do you have?
Well, the advice that I would give is that it's going to take resources to do this work. You need to make connections in order to do this work. So in terms of resources, Rutgers spent quite a lot of money for us to be able to do this research, right? When the students came in 2016 and called for this history, and Rutgers said, okay, we'll look into it. They put their money where their mouth is. They hired scores of graduate students to do this research. They hired postdoctoral researchers because that's what it was going to take. And still, it took us, 6 years to produce these 3 books, which is actually extremely fast. The only way we were able to do what we did in the time that we did is because of the amount of financial resources allowed us to have a pretty large team of historians doing this work. So I would say that's essential to make that commitment. And also the commitment of time. Like I said, history takes a long time, even if you have 20 people working on it. So, you're not going to get the answer that you're looking for in a year, right? You're not going to find a solution in 2 years. You have to commit to the process that this is going to be a long-term commitment. If we're really serious about reparative justice, this is not a 1 to 2 year thing, right? So that's one thing. And then also making connections with other people who are doing similar work. One thing we did at Rutgers is join the Universities Studying Slavery, which is a consortium of universities who are studying slavery, and we've learned a lot from them. But I would say for the Episcopal Church, there's other churches who are working on this. There are other colleges in New Jersey and local institutions like historical societies across the state who are looking at these questions. So reach out. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? You want to look at your particular history, of course, and do a deep dive on that. But some of the basis, you don't have to reinvent. You can talk to other people. I know in 2017, I gave a talk sort of like this for the New Brunswick Theological Seminary while they were starting to grapple with this question of reparations. I'm not sure where they're at now, but hopefully they've progressed and maybe that's someone to talk to. So I think making connections with other people who are having these same conversations is essential for doing this work.
I would just add on to that yes, making connections is really important and can help you facilitate this work because there are many people who are concerned with these questions right now. And, getting connected with the New Jersey Historical Commission would be a good thing because they are thinking about this question a lot and they're in conversation a lot with different historical societies throughout New Jersey, different historical sites throughout New Jersey that are trying to reevaluate the story that they've been telling. And so they're generating a lot of resources in this moment in time for people who are trying to engage in this kind of work and in this kind of exploration of their own institutional history. So if you have them on your radar in terms of the events that they're producing, the conferences they're producing, and the different resources they're putting out there, I think that that would be, that's a great resource for you.
Thank you both for that. We have our first question from Reverend Scott Russell, Rutgers. I believe that's right, Reverend Scott Russell, Rutgers. He indicates that Rutgers has made some great strides towards racial justice, including the founding of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center in 1969. But what's missing? What's next?
Well, there's a lot missing, obviously. A cultural center, which, is great, a great start. It's important to have spaces for Black programming, for Black students to feel welcome. That's essential. But I mean, there's several things that the university is working on now, including diversifying the faculty and the administration. Right? Rutgers is a pretty diverse place. Actually, it's one of the things that prides itself on. The student body is extremely diverse. Rutgers Newark is one of the most diverse campuses in the country. But the faculty and the administration does not reflect that. And you can, I'm sure, imagine why that's problematic. You don't have courses being taught that students are interested in. You don't have mentors and advocates. Getting through college is hard. You need people who look like you in places of leadership. So definitely diversifying the campus leadership is important, which we've made stride. We got our first Black president, Jonathan Holloway, starting in 2020. So definitely more diversity throughout all parts of the university is one step. Jesse, do you have any ideas for other things?
Well, I think that, as a historian, I think a lot about what historically Black people at Rutgers have been asking for. And I think that that's one place for institutions to look to when they're deciding what's next. How do we deal with reparations or any kind of reparative justice? And what role does historical work play in that? Well, when we look at Rutgers and the students who 50 years ago at Rutgers were asking for change, they came to the university with plans. They had proposals. They didn't just come with grievances. And that's what I think for me, looking in the archive is incredible, is looking at, these students, they were not just coming up and saying, well, we don't like what you're doing and we're upset about that. They said, well, this is how you fix things. These are the actual proposals that we have. And this is how you can build a more inclusive campus. This is how you can actually educate the Black people of New Jersey who have been historically excluded from your institution. So I think that part of the work has to be, looking at even those proposals from 50 years ago and saying, well, what have we done since Scarlet and Black has come on the scene, but right, what have we done since these students 50 years ago were asking for some of these things, and saying that some of them have been accomplished, but others, they haven't been, and why? Right? What has been in the way? Why have some of these things been brushed aside? And revisiting some of those things, I think, can inspire change.
So just briefly, I made a mistake. I thought I was making a mistake. That's why I said I think I got that right. But Father Scott Russell is actually the Episcopal chaplain at Rutgers, which is why it's hyphenated Rutgers. So thank you for that clarification, Father Russell, and thank you for naming that, putting that question forward from where you sit as the Episcopal chaplain at Rutgers. And also just briefly here before going to a couple more questions, Connie Campbell Pearson also notes, and I think that Connie is from the Diocese of Montana, I believe. She writes, what's absolutely amazing to me is that the records of these activities, she says damning activities, were carefully archived and preserved. What a treasure trove of information you have shifted through, and she expresses her thanks. But now to another question. We'll start with a question about We'll start with another question about Rutgers from Father Zamboni, and given the hour, I will go ahead and ask the second question, and you can take them both in order. The first question from Jack Zamboni is, for a bit over a year now, Rutgers has been led by its first Black president. Did the Scarlet and Black work play a role in laying the groundwork for the calling of President Holloway? And then the other question is from Stephen Clark. I'm so glad we're committed to discussing reparations. What might some of the first actions toward reparations be, and how thoroughly do we need to discuss this before taking action? So I'll let you both take those in the order that you find appropriate, given the flow of your earlier comments.
Well, I think on the subject of President Holloway, I think, I like to think that the Rutgers, the Scarlet and Black project, and, the project have represented a commitment by the institution to tell its story in a new way. I think that, I like to think that helped to lay the groundwork for the institution to choose President Holloway to lead us next. But I'm not sure about that 100%, right? I wasn't on the Board of Governors when they were making that decision. But what I do know, and what I have heard from President Holloway himself, is that it certainly played a role in him accepting the position, in him being interested in it. And I think that, we're very lucky to have him as a leader at Rutgers at this time. And he made it very clear that part of what attracted him to the institution was how seriously the institution takes this effort to really tell our history in a more honest way, and to not run away from it, not to say, well, that this is bad things. We don't want to, we want to put that in the past because it's unsavory. No, let's be honest, and recognizing that a lot of institutions shy away from this kind of historical exploration, but you don't have to, and it can make you stronger as an institution. I think he was impressed by that, and I think that's one of the things that brought him here.
Can you repeat what the second question was?
Man, you're gonna mess me up, Dr. Boyd. Just give me 1 second, I'm sorry. I believe, here it is. I'm gonna combine it with another question that came through, because they're almost the same question. Stephen Clark noted, what might some of the first actions toward reparations be, and how thoroughly do we need to discuss them before taking action? And I think that that's also connected to the question from Kevin Thompson. How do we address congregations and individuals which say, this is unfortunate, but it has nothing to do with me. My family wasn't involved. It's in the past, let's move on. So those two questions together, I believe, are connected.
Well, to the last question, I would say, it just comes down to, if you believe that racism has existed historically, that white supremacy has been the law of the land for all of US history, and whether or not whites have benefited from that, which, of course, as a historian of African American history, I say yes. And there's a lot of scholarship that shows that whites, even if you didn't own slaves, even if you feel like, you don't come from an elite place or from a privileged place, your whiteness has benefited you and your ancestors. And it came at the expense of Black people, right? This is the whole idea behind white supremacy, that in any way we can make white people better, that benefits whites. So even if it's just, in the past, a white person walking down the street and a Black person has to get off the side of the street, that was a social benefit for white people. And it came at the harm of Black people. So to me, that's just the basic question, the basic understanding. And I don't know, I feel like if I was a white person and I understood that the legacy of the racial history in the United States was that we as a group, as a wider group, do have a responsibility. We as a wider group benefited from the oppression of Black people. So why now we as a wider group don't have a responsibility to make up for it, right? You don't have to say necessarily, I did something terrible. Me personally, I enslaved someone, but you can say, it was wrong what happened to Black people. And as we've talked about throughout this whole hour, it didn't just stop, right? It's continued, whether you're looking at policing during slavery, after slavery, in the Black Power era in the 90s, or right now in Black Lives Matter. There's a connection. And no matter what aspect you look at in society, this connection is there. So you can't just break from the past. The present is directly related to the past. And to me, that means we have a responsibility to try to fix it.
So Dr. Boyd, thank you for your answer. You know, I noted to everyone earlier tonight that we are led in this work by the co-conveners of the task force, Canon Annette Buchanan, Canon Barbie Bach, and Canon Noreen Duncan. They have given me marching orders and I follow those directions. One of those is that we stop a little bit early tonight, and so that there can be a couple of other matters announced. And I wanted to note something, though, just briefly take a point of personal privilege. There was a point that that both you, Dr. Boyd and Dr. Bayker, indicated that we need to look in the archive in two particular points. One is not to assume that we already know, to dig into the archive and find out what the lessons are from the earlier time. And that is very instructive. You've also stressed the importance of restorative and reparative work, which I would remind folks is in the labyrinth of becoming beloved community is in the fourth quadrant of repair. And I put in the chat the article, "We are demanding $500 million for reparations, the Black Manifesto, mainline religious denominations and Black economic development," which cited a couple of those quotes that I gave. And I think that makes the point that you were making earlier about the need to look at earlier periods to see what we can find. So without further ado, when we all together tonight, we have an opportunity to build on the work that Dr. Bayker and Dr. Boyd have led in the state of New Jersey at Rutgers. Would you join me in thanking them in the Zoom way for their contribution to our work tonight? And now we turn it back to our canons, the co-conveners of this task force.
It sounds like the commercial time. I want to thank you again, Reverend Chuck, Drs. Bayker and Boyd, for your wonderful presentation. And as I mentioned at the start of the hour, Bishop Stokes has asked that we organize an action in the Diocese of New Jersey. So that information is what I'm bringing you today, because many of you were not on. So the goal of this action is to take the lead in organizing in Speaker Craig Coughlin's district to advocate for the passage of S322 and A711, an act calling for the establishment of a statewide Reparations Task Force in New Jersey. These bills have languished without his bringing them to a vote for almost 3 years. So this is to put pressure on him to act. So we're having two actions. First one is a virtual on Monday, October 11th at 7 p.m. and in person on October 30th at 10 a.m. at St. Peter's, Perth Amboy. And the significance of having it at St. Peter's, St. Amboy, again, is that Mr. Thomas Peterson Mundy, who was known to be the parishioner of this church, was the first African-American of the US to cast a vote after the enactment of the 15th Amendment. So your action, Diocese of New Jersey and allies, is to attend the virtual and in-person rally, to call your legislatures to support these two bills, S322 and A711, and sign a petition that we will be circulating with you shortly. Thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to having you work towards this important work in our diocese. God bless. Thank you, Reverend Chuck, Doctors Bayker and Boyd once again, and thank you all.